Councilmember Katz and I are, as respective chairs of the committees, co-chairing this discussion. I think I will kick it off, and then when it gets to courts and sheriff, Councilmember Katz will chair. Okay. And so we are here today to first talk about the OLO report, Evictions in Montgomery County. We're going to get a review of the study from our OLO staff. I was thinking we ought to invite DHCA just to come up so that we'll be ready for the discussion. And I think we ought to put a time limit on this, and we can continue that discussion if we need to. There's specific items in here that might take some time to work our ways through, but we need to get to the second item, which is the just cause eviction. And I think for that conversation, we'll have a discussion today. There's no vote that would happen. The vote that would happen would be a full council vote. So we will just consider issues for staff follow-up and discussion to take it to the full council. So just to put context on what the overall agenda for today is. So why don't we begin with our report, and Stephanie and Natalia.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Bryant, and this is Natalia Carasosa and Kelly Robinson with the Office of Legislative Oversight. We appreciate this opportunity to present the OLO report on evictions in Montgomery County. We thank all stakeholders for their cooperation and assistance in completing this report, including the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, executive branch departments, municipality representatives, and community organizations. For this report, Council requested that OLO review the eviction process and eviction data to help the county better understand how it might assist low-income households facing eviction. To begin, we define eviction. A formal eviction is a legal process initiated by the landlord to regain possession of the rental property through a court-ordered eviction of the tenant, executed by the sheriff. This process is primarily governed by state law and is the focus of the OLO report. Of note, tenants may be forced to move from the rental property for other reasons. This includes tenants who voluntarily leave the property to avoid a formal eviction. Generally, there are three legal reasons a landlord may use to evict a tenant through the formal eviction process. Failure to pay rent is when a landlord seeks to evict a tenant who did not pay rent when it is due, as stated in the lease. We anecdotally heard that these are the most frequently filed and heard eviction actions in district court. A landlord may also choose to evict a tenant who overstays their lease or breaches the lease in another way, like failing to maintain their property. This presentation will cover 6 topics. We will start with a walkthrough of the formal eviction process in Montgomery County and a discussion of the drivers and consequences of evictions. That will be followed by a presentation of data on evictions and a review of emergency financial assistance programs and court-based eviction prevention programs. We will conclude with a summary of OLO's discussion issues and recommendations. I will begin to discussing the process to evict a tenant for failure to pay rent. Before walking through the individual process steps, I want to talk about 3 key aspects of a failure to pay rent action. The first is time frame. It takes about 12 to 13 weeks to evict a tenant for failure to pay rent in Montgomery County, though landlords report that this can take significantly longer. This time frame varies across jurisdictions in Maryland and depends on several factors, including when the landlord files, the date of the court hearing, and time to schedule the eviction. Second, under state law, a landlord is not required to provide the tenant with notice prior to filing the complaint. Other legal eviction actions require notice. Landlords may file the day after rent is due and unpaid. This may increase filings as courts become the first stop for landlords to recover back rent. We found that states with pre-filing notice requirements have lower filing rates than jurisdictions in Maryland. And third, under state law, unlike other legal eviction actions, payment of rent owed in a failure to pay rent case may stop the eviction. However, a tenant with 3 or more failure to pay rent judgments in a 12-month period may not be able to stop the eviction, even if rent is paid. This can increase filings as landlords must repeatedly file against the same tenant. Turning to the process steps for a failure to pay rent action, we begin the process with a lease between the landlord and the tenant. The lease states when rent is due, usually on the 1st of the month. The 1st of the month comes and goes, and the tenant does not pay rent. On the 2nd of the month, the landlord can go to district court to file a failure to pay rent complaint. Stakeholders in Montgomery County report that commonly landlords will wait until the 10th of the month to file when the county code permits late fees to be charged. When the landlord files the complaint, the court clerk schedules a hearing 3 to 4 weeks after the filing. Cases are primarily heard on Wednesdays. The court forwards the summons to the sheriff, who serves the tenant. Step 2 begins about a month from when the landlord filed the complaint. The case is heard in district court. If the court awards judgment to the landlord, the tenant has 4 days to voluntarily leave the property. If the tenant does not leave, the landlord can request the writ of restitution, which is the court order authorizing the eviction. A landlord has 60 days to request the writ. Step 3. Once the writ is requested, it can take up to 21 days for the judge to sign the writ. Once signed, the landlord calls the sheriff's office to schedule the eviction. The sheriff's office generally schedules evictions 4 to 5 weeks from the date of when the landlord calls. After the date is confirmed, the sheriff's office will post the final eviction notice on the rental property. Step 4. About a month has passed from when the landlord called the sheriff's office. On the day of the eviction, the sheriff's office executes the writ and secures the property. The landlord's movers remove the tenant's property to the nearest public right-of-way, and possession is returned to the landlord. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Kelly, who will discuss the drivers and consequences of evictions.
Good afternoon. This next slide summarizes the drivers and consequences of evictions. Much of this information comes from feedback from community organizations. Essentially, what we heard from stakeholders is that the main driver of evictions in Montgomery County is the lack of affordable housing. When folks are spending upwards of 50% of their incomes on rent, it's very easy to fall behind, especially when unexpected expenses or drops in income occur. However, we also heard about...
Yes.
Ms. Robinson,
Yes.
you're a new face here, I think.
No, I've been with OLO for 6 years.
Wow. Well, I've not seen you at this dais. I've not seen you at this dais. But
This is my
perhaps
second-
different committees. This is your second report? Fantastic. Well, I'm really glad that you're here, and
Thank you.
thanks for your work over the years, and especially your work now that we're taking up.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Everyone's new to me, so it's good to see you all.
Me too.
Okay. However, we also heard about other factors that contribute to evictions, including disability and mental illness, the lack of awareness of a tenant's responsibilities, and the lack of access to legal advice, poor housing conditions that can cause a variety of issues, including high utility costs, as well as discrimination and retaliation. There's national research, for example, which shows that landlords may possibly discriminate on the basis of race or family status, including the presence of children, when deciding whether or not to pursue eviction in some specific cases. Evictions have a number of consequences for both the landlords and the tenants. The landlords have to pay legal and court fees and often lose several months of unpaid rent that they are usually unable to recover. For tenants, the consequences of eviction are serious and long-standing. Many episodes of homelessness begin with eviction, but even those tenants that do not experience homelessness may face job loss and economic instability, along with problems accessing safe and adequate housing and impacts on their children's education, especially if they have to switch schools.
So I'm going to talk now about data on evictions. This first slide just kind of gives you an overall picture of what the data look like. In FY17, there were just under 46,000 landlord-tenant cases filed. Most landlord-tenant cases are failure to pay rent cases, as Stephanie mentioned. We don't have exact data on this. Those 46,000 cases generated just over 10,000 writs of restitution, which are those eviction orders that are signed by the judge and sent to the sheriff's office. And then the sheriff's office conducted 836 evictions. So the vast majority of writs did not result in eviction by the sheriff. Now, we did look at detailed data on those writs and found that in the majority of cases, tenants did avoid the eviction by paying the rent, but in at least 2,000 cases per year, the tenant moved out voluntarily, so they were displaced even though they were not evicted by the sheriff. So the 836 number doesn't really capture all of the cases that resulted in tenants being displaced. We also did a geographic analysis of the data, and the way that we did it here is by looking at what are called election districts. They're shown on this map on the slide, and these districts, just so you're aware, are not the same as congressional districts or council districts. They're districts used by the Board of Elections to organize election precincts. But the benefit of using these districts is that the Census Bureau publishes demographic data for them, and you'll see some of that on the next slide. But this slide just shows the overall numbers of evictions per district. It's not adjusted for population or anything like that. And it's not surprising to see that the districts with the most evictions are those with the largest populations living in poverty in the county. So that includes District 13, which incorporates Silver Spring and Wheaton, District 9, which includes Gaithersburg and the southern portion of Germantown, and District 5, which includes Burtonsville and White Oak. So this next slide has a little bit more data. It's kind of the same data, but in a different format. I included only the districts with the most rental housing in the county, but the report does have a full table. And what this table has, in addition to the number of evictions, is both the writs of restitution and evictions per 1,000 rental housing units. So those columns that say per 1,000 units are adjusted for the amount of rental housing in that particular district. And one of the things that this data kind of highlights is that we don't, the northern section of Germantown and Clarksburg, so that's District 2, actually has a lot of writs of restitution and evictions relative to the amount of rental housing in that district. So it doesn't show up on the map on the previous page because this area just isn't as densely populated as the top 3 districts, but it is one that is highly impacted by evictions. Another type of analysis that we did as part of this report is looking at the types of properties where evictions occur. And we used data from the planning department for this. These categories refer to the property use. Certain buildings are categorized in that data as apartments, some as condominiums, and some are single-family homes. And unsurprisingly, most writs and most evictions occur on properties that are classified as apartments. And most of those occur in garden apartments, which are buildings without an elevator. But condominiums and single-family homes, which can be rented out to tenants by their owners, account for 12% and 14% respectively of all evictions. So they account for about a quarter of evictions. A related item that we found when looking at the data, and specifically apartment properties, is that relatively few properties accounted for a lot of evictions. So out of about 600 apartment properties with at least 10 housing units each, 131 of those properties accounted for 64%, or nearly 2/3 of evictions in apartments. We also looked at the rents in buildings with a lot of writs and evictions, and generally found that evictions tend to occur most often in buildings with relatively lower rents. So this isn't to say that the rents are necessarily affordable for the people who live there, but by and large, most evictions do not occur in the highest cost apartment buildings in the county. So now I'm going to talk about emergency financial assistance, which is the primary way that the county currently works to prevent evictions. Emergency financial assistance refers to assistance for households that is typically one-time or short-term, and it's for households facing emergencies like eviction or utility shutoffs. And our report has a review of the research literature on these types of programs, and what it shows is essentially that emergency financial assistance is effective in preventing homelessness. So in other words, researchers have shown that these programs actually reduce the number of households that experience homelessness. Now, researchers have also found that many of these programs provide assistance to a lot of folks that are not necessarily at high risk of homelessness, meaning that a lot of people who receive assistance would not necessarily experience homelessness if they hadn't received assistance. They would likely be able to avoid eviction or find other housing even if they hadn't gotten that assistance. And because of this, the researchers argue that the programs could be more cost effective if they more narrowly targeted the programs to the households at highest risk of homelessness. the caveat to this is that this research does not account for the benefit of preventing eviction or utility shutoff in and of itself. So even if a family wouldn't necessarily become homeless, there's still a benefit to preventing them from having to move, often to a less desirable situation. And the research that we looked at in this report did not necessarily account for that benefit. The other related point in the research is that sometimes in order to help the most vulnerable populations, so those at highest risk of homelessness, a lot of programs have found that they need to provide multiple months of assistance. So for example, 3 months of assistance or 6 months of assistance coupled with case management in order to help these most vulnerable households get back on their feet. So what's happening in Montgomery County? Overall, the county provided about $7 million in FY18 for emergency financial assistance programs operated by DHHS, DHCA, and community organizations. That $7 million does include the cost of the personnel in DHHS and their operating costs, as well as direct assistance provided to households. So for the DHHS program, the direct assistance provided to households totaled about $2.2 million in county funding, plus an additional $600,000 in state funding. Looking at the funding that's provided for community organizations through community grants, that's about $430,000. Last year, Bethesda Cares commissioned a study on Bethesda Cares Emergency Assistance Program, which estimated that community organizations in Montgomery County provide approximately $800,000 to $1 million in emergency financial assistance each year. So that's about double what they're receiving from the county. In terms of the emergency financial assistance programs operated by the county government, these programs primarily target households that can avoid eviction with one-time financial assistance. So there's a requirement that households have a workable plan, meaning that a household must be able to sustain its current housing in the future in order to be eligible for that assistance. Households that don't meet that requirement may be able to receive assistance of other kinds, for example, moving expenses. Now, as I mentioned before, in other jurisdictions, we did see many programs offer multiple months of assistance in order to help those most vulnerable households get back on their feet. One of the issues that we identified with DHHS's programs is that they're not currently tracking data on the demographics of emergency financial assistance recipients. So we don't have information on what zip codes they come from, what their incomes are. We don't have information, for example, on whether they receive repeat assistance. And so this is something that they're working on, but without these data, it's difficult for us to assess whether the program is reaching its intended population or serving its intended purpose. So I also wanted to briefly mention another aspect of eviction prevention in Montgomery County, which relates to the Housing Opportunities Commission. There is some limited research that shows that subsidized housing providers can reduce evictions as well as lower their own costs by providing eviction prevention programming. The HOC has two efforts to prevent eviction. First, it works with it works to provide emergency financial assistance to its customers through a collaboration with DHHS. And second, the Resident Services Division of HOC provides eviction prevention programming, which includes proactively reaching out to customers at risk of eviction and counseling them on addressing lease violations and resolving other issues. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie, who's going to discuss another category of eviction prevention and talk about our recommended discussion issues and recommendations.
So thank you. We're going to talk about court-based eviction prevention programs. Studies have shown that tenants with legal assistance are less likely to be evicted. However, the majority of tenants lack legal assistance. Court-based eviction prevention programs partner with housing courts to provide on-site legal services. OLO found 3 types of programs. The first is a court navigator program, which uses supervised non-attorney volunteers to assist unrepresented tenants navigate the process. This can include helping to complete forms or attending the hearing as a support person. The second is limited legal representation, which is time-limited task-specific assistance by an attorney, which could be helping to negotiate a settlement agreement And the third is full legal representation, which is legal representation by an attorney for the duration of the case. So in addition to stakeholder interviews, OLO observed district court proceedings in Montgomery County and found that a majority of tenants who appeared at the hearing lacked legal representation. In presenting cases, these tenants often lacked an understanding of housing laws and court processes, and this was especially true for tenants with limited and landlords with limited English proficiency. These findings align with experiences of tenants documented in other studies, which show that without legal assistance, tenants may fail to present evidence or raise valid defenses against eviction, or accept settlement terms that might be against their best interest. However, unlike other jurisdictions nationally, OLO found a gap in services exist in Montgomery County. Legal assistance programs are not available on-site at the courthouse. If an unrepresented tenant appears for the hearing, there are no resources available to help them navigate the process, attend a settlement negotiation, or provide representation in court. Additionally, existing legal aid programs that are available in the county, which provide full legal representation, serve limited tenant populations, like tenants living in subsidized housing, or address very specific legal issues like utility shutoffs. As a result, many tenants are going through the legal eviction process without the benefit of legal advice. Based on this report's findings, OLO has 3 recommended discussion issues and 3 recommendations for council action. I'm going to talk about the discussion issues first. First, as mentioned, Maryland jurisdictions have a higher filing rate, which may be due to a lack of pre-filing notice and failure to pay rent actions. The resulting discussion question is to review the benefits and drawbacks of establishing a pre-filing notice requirement in state law with relevant stakeholders. Second, OLO found that tenants often seek emergency assistance after the eviction is scheduled, which can make it more difficult to divert the eviction. The question we recommend is to discuss opportunities to promote existing eviction prevention resources earlier in the process. Our final discussion issue is based on the finding that there was no legal assistance programs available on-site at the courthouse, and existing programs reach limited populations. As a result, we recommend discussing the feasibility of partnering with the district court or other stakeholders to provide enhanced legal assistance to tenants. Turning to our recommendations, first, OLO found that rent obligations and contact information for emergency assistance programs are not clearly defined in the plain language lease summary. OLO recommends that this document be reviewed for possible revisions. Second, OLO found that a relatively small number of properties accounted for most of the writs and evictions in the county. In response, OLO recommends that strategies be developed to reduce evictions at these properties. And finally, OLO found that HHS does not track data on households that receive emergency financial assistance, including zip code, gender, race, income, and repeat use of the program. OLO recommends that this data be tracked and reported in order to evaluate program effectiveness. Thank you, and this concludes our presentation. We want to recognize the many stakeholders here in attendance, including representatives from the Sheriff's Office, DHCA, DHHS, HOC, AOBA, the Emergency Assistance Coalition, and the Renters Alliance. And we turn the discussion back to the chairs.
Okay, very good. I've got some questions, but Mr. Katz, why don't you take it away?
Thank you very much. First off, a wonderful report. It really was. I mean, I know that this was a lot of work went into this, not from just you all, but from many people in the audience. So sincerely appreciate it. You know, one of the things that strikes you is that the areas that are the highest are what we know where the most garden apartments are. I mean, that's and the information that you've given certainly reminds us of that as well. So the question becomes, and I know that you were talking about that if someone has legal representation that they can make a settlement. What kind of settlement do they make if they haven't paid their rent? I mean, if there's other things, I understand that, but.
Sure. So what we found in other jurisdictions is that Durham County runs a eviction diversion program, and so some of the settlements that they work towards is maybe an extended move-out time frame. To give the tenant more time to move out so you're not going through that court process and ending up with a complaint or a judgment against you. Or maybe a payment plan to figure out how to work off to pay what is owed.
Okay. And we talked about the pre-filing notice, and you said that it's state law. Can Montgomery County have its own law for that? Are we not allowed to have that under state law?
So our understanding is that it would require a change to state law in order to create a pre-filing notice requirement in Montgomery County.
Because to me, that would be not only beneficial, it would be the most beneficial to everybody, to the landlord who's costing them, money as well. This is, and they're in the rental business. They want their income. And certainly to the tenant. I mean, they want to be able to have a home. So to me, that's something that we should explore, is to ask our state delegation to look into what we can do in that. I think as part of, we're talking about legal representation, and that's certainly at that moment is what you need when you're in court. But I also think that we should have something about financial counseling. I mean, if somebody is not able to pay their rent 3 or 4 times out of a 12-month period, there's an issue, and perhaps we can help them with that issue to allow them to know what benefits they can have living in Montgomery County. And I also have to tell you that years ago in the city of Gaithersburg, when we had some housing, that apartments that were torn down and new apartments, more dense apartments were going there. And what happened was, in that case, the city negotiated with the owner of the property, was a new owner who had bought it, that they would have to give everybody back their security deposit because it didn't make any difference what it looked like because they were tearing it down anyhow. We made it a deal that the tenant, I believe, didn't have to pay the last month's rent, and so that they could start to find a new place to be. And the city helped them move and all of those sorts of things. I mean, everybody on an individual basis was helped. But the bottom line is, with the money that was handed to them, to the tenant, from the security deposit and the last month's rent and everything, in some cases, not in every case certainly, but in some cases, they were able to actually secure home ownership. That their rent was close to what their mortgage was going to be, and how that worked out. And it was really the thing that was stopping them was the down payment. And as I say, it didn't happen in every case. I don't want to give that impression, but that's something else that we should be thinking about. If we have this help that Montgomery County does and should have, then maybe we should also take it to the next step to see if this could be some other way could be of assistance. So anyhow, thank you for the report.
Okay, thanks. Everyone has their light on, so I will proceed in order. Why don't we have DHCA, though, come up to the front, and that way you can address questions as well. I wanted to just say that this report really grapples with a huge challenge, which is that there are many people who are living on the margin, and they're not able to pay their rent at times. And it looks like that is the overwhelming case of the overwhelming situation resulting in eviction or in the filings is non-payment of rent. And I'm sure there are some cases where a person is just, poorly manages themselves and just has some kind of issue where they don't prioritize paying their rent monthly, even if they could. But I'm sure that for the most part, we're talking about residents who are just living on the margins, and whether they're experiencing unemployment for a period or some kind of expense that has really sent them over the edge. They can't make their rent payment, and perhaps that happens repeatedly over the course of some period of time. And that is a significant social issue and challenge, and we try to address the circumstances that might lead a person to, we try to address the causes that might lead a person to be in those circumstances through many different initiatives, whether that is tax reform, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, or wage policy, like the minimum wage, or health care, so that they can have access to community clinics and perhaps address an issue before it becomes an acute issue, or affordable transportation. So many ways that we try to, childcare subsidies. So many ways we try to help people who are living at the margin. But You know, we don't do enough, and people nevertheless find themselves in these very challenging circumstances. And this is probably one of the worst things that can happen to a person, and especially to families and kids, and the consequences for children in their education of if they're evicted and have to change schools, you know, can be really profound. So it is something that we want to, and this report helps put a spotlight on and allow us to begin thinking about how we can help. And I just observed that that is a very different issue than the just cause eviction issue. Just cause eviction is not about failure to pay rent because it's specifically is considered a just cause. So, you know, the great volume of work that we are talking about in this context of non-payment is really about how do you help families that are struggling? You know, what can you do to intervene and provide support and provide services because non-payment is their problem. So the recommendations that you've provided are really in that kind of genre of whether it's pre-filing or financial assistance or legal assistance. It's, you know, by and large going to be helping people who are for whom non-payment is economic circumstances are probably the reason. And I think it's terrific to pull that out, and I think we can really start thinking about how we might be able to provide support to people who are in those circumstances. So with that kind of backgrounder, we'll go through the discussion some more. Mr. Albornoz, I have you, followed by Will, followed by Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning we held the Health and Human Services Committee discussion on the effects of the shutdown. And so it's awful as a backdrop that we're discussing evictions when federal workers this Friday will not receive their second paycheck. Most of those folks are living paycheck to paycheck. There is a disproportionate amount of people who are receiving federal funds who will not be receiving those federal funds. And we are about to fall off a cliff. That was the sense that I got this morning. The incidences of domestic violence have gone up significantly in the last week. The calls to the crisis center. I am going to lose a lot of sleep, as I'm sure especially those impacted by this issue are losing sleep now. And there will have to be, as this continues, another conversation in the very near future about intervention that the county will have to embark in, because we have many people who will not be able to afford their rent in the very near future, which is going to impact our entire community in ways both obvious and not so obvious. So it's a terrible way to start my comments, but it just is very much in the, not just in the back of my mind, but in the forefront of my mind right now. I do want to shift and say great report. I really did enjoy my conversation with you guys and feel that the recommendations are very tangible and specific and doable, and do appreciate the context by which and how well you guys did in producing this report, so thank you. I did have a couple of questions with regards to our court system. So the 46,000 cases that our courts are hearing, did you get any feedback from our judicial branch on their ability to absorb those cases and what that looks like on their side of the aisle? How quickly are they able to credibly go through these cases in a way that they would like? And then I have a follow-up question to that.
Sure, I'll start. So we did meet with the district court clerk's office. We got a sense that it's 46,000 cases that are heard, as you had stated. In talking about failure to pay rent cases, those cases move very quickly. It really is, was there a lease, when was rent due, and was rent not paid? So when we went and observed court, the cases moved very quickly through the system for the ones that were heard. In looking at other jurisdictions in Maryland do hold court maybe 4 to 5 days a week. So they go through cases a lot quicker. Now in cases like Baltimore City and Prince George's, who do hold court for 4 to 5 days, they have substantial number more filings than we do. And so they need to have the court system move forward. Do you have anything to add?
And did you get the sense that our court has the capacity to add another day or two if that were feasible?
We didn't get into that specifically. That would have to be followed up with the courts.
Okay. And I especially appreciated your recommendation about intervention. earlier in the process. I know in a separate public safety hearing, I learned that our fire and rescue squad, this is an aside, not related, but I just use it as an example of potentially a best practice. But when they are responding multiple times to the same house, they are now, as a matter of policy, referring those cases directly to our Department of Health and Human Services and their crisis intervention team. When PEPCO or WSSC shut down water supply or electricity, is there a provision or is there a best practice by which they are reporting that to somebody or some entity? Is that currently going on? I know both agencies have funds that they draw down from to help with assistance on a need basis, but from a policy perspective, I was just curious if that's occurring.
So we're not aware of any provision like that. I don't know if any of our guests from DHCA know.
Can I just, is someone allowed to live in a home if there's no water? I know about electricity, but is there, if, I'm not sure, I think they have to notify somebody. Excuse me? You're gonna need to,
No, it results in condemnation.
that's what I
They're
thought.
aware, but they don't automatically report to DHCA that the water has been cut off somewhere. So
Okay.
we react to it when we find out, but we're not automatically notified of it, no.
Perhaps that's something else we should see if we can. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Right. No, so that's it for now. Got some follow-up questions, particularly for our providers that are also in this space as well, but I'll defer to my colleagues.
All right. Will?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I want to echo the comments. Great report, a lot of great information. So just so I'm clear, the data on the evictions was FY17, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And so 2,000 voluntarily left and were displaced in addition to the 836 evictions.
So, yes, I think the 2,000 number is actually an average from FY14 to FY17, but that's,
Okay. But around there,
Around that
we could
amount.
find the number. Is there data on that larger number, that 2,000 average? Obviously, it changes from year to year. Why, on anything about where these people went, how long they were displaced? Is there any data that we're able to? I know that'd be difficult, but is there anything on that?
Sure. So we don't have information on that. The data we received didn't include any personally identifiable information, so we couldn't really track folks in that manner.
But we just know that they left.
Sure.
Right, okay.
And perhaps the representatives from HHS can also speak to kind of their ability to track folks as they move through these stages of the process.
Right. You don't have anything to add on that? That you guys wouldn't be involved in that in any way? I also saw the note, the data sheet on you concentrated, not only is it geographically concentrated in East and Down County and Up County, there are the similar buildings. You said, I forget the slide, but there were, yeah, certain apartments are more responsible than others. Not just the types, but the actual buildings. There it was, that one. Did you do a level of analysis on the property owners and overlaying with that? Is there anything that we should know there? Did you look at that?
Sure. So we did try to look at that. It's a little bit challenging because property owners in the data from the planning department are sometimes, it's not always the same actual name listed for the same property owner. So it's a little bit messy, but that's something that we could do a more deep dive into.
I'd be interested to see if there was some, I imagine there might be some, I don't know, but I'd love to see if there's any relationship.
Sure.
And then the last, this might be for DHCA and HOC potentially too, $7 million that we give out in assistance, is that you all who's that go through? That's DHHS, right? Okay, and are they here as well?
Yeah.
Okay,
Bring them up.
good, yeah, this is a related question.
Could HHS come up so we can talk about the financial assistance that we provide?
Thank you. And I just have one more after this. How are you?
And if everyone could introduce themselves. Rosie, you didn't introduce yourself, but please do that.
Rosie McCray Moody, Manager, Office of Landlord, Tenant Affairs.
Hi there, Tim Getzinger, Acting Director of DHCA.
And I'm Stephanie Killian, Chief of the Division of Housing at the Department of Housing and Community Affairs.
Amanda Harris, Chief of Services to End and Prevent Homelessness with HHS.
And I'm Sarah, excuse me, I'm Sarah Black. I'm Administrator for Housing Stabilization Services and Services to End and Prevent Homelessness.
Great, thank you very much. So $7 million roughly, as I think I saw the number that was given out last year in assistance. What, is that not, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Just wanted to clarify, that wasn't $7 million in financial assistance that went out to the community. It's $7 million that covers the services that we provide. It also includes the staff that we need in order to actually do that work.
And so the money that actually goes out to the community, I'm looking at it here, what that is, that's going to be what? Go ahead.
Sorry, it's not listed on the slide, but you
Yeah.
can,
It's approximately $4 million.
4 million, okay, great. I had heard that number too, okay. And of that, what's the, is there an average amount that's given out?
So that is an excellent question, and we do not have the best answer for it. So the way it works is, at HHS, we have a limited amount of money, so we have a cap on how much assistance we can provide. We also have there's other resources available. So some people might come in and let's say their balance is $7,000 in back rent. So they might be able to access a state grant for some of that, and then some local funds from us at HHS, and then we would make up the difference by working with our community partners at the Emergency Assistance Coalition. So we can tell you how many grants we issued, but it's hard for us to at this point, determine what is the total amount that people are requesting. But that's certainly something that we are trying to figure out how we get an answer to that, because that's a really important question. Our rate, the maximum benefit that we can pay out has been flat for
2012.
some time,
What's
since
that
2012.
number?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, so the maximum that a household would be eligible for in a 12-month period through county funds is $1,750. If it's a family with minor children, they may be eligible for funding that we administer on behalf of the state through the Emergency Assistance with Families with Children program. And for eviction prevention, for example, they'd be eligible for an additional up to $1,500 for that eviction. That program has specific separate guidelines based on the state. That would be once every 24 months. So we typically act as a central point of contact, and then we'll try and wrap a package of assistance around a family when they have an emergency.
Got it. Well, let us know, we can do this offline, how we can help you get that information I think is critical if we're trying to assess the need, in addition to knowing where it's happening, why it's happening, how much is needed. And you said that 1750 number for 12 months has been static for how long?
I believe that was 2012.
Okay.
I'd have to go back and check when
So
we
at
last
least 7
adjusted
years,
it.
7
Yeah,
years-ish.
it's been a while.
Okay.
It wasn't 2012, it was 2014. Like I said, I have to go back and think.
Okay. Thank you for
But
that.
we can get that to you.
That'd be great. And then my last question was related to I know there was mention of an HOC counseling program, or that was earlier in the process. I know I saw Mr. Spann in the back, but maybe you may or may not be needed for this. But yeah, just in case. Thank you. One seat left. Yeah. You want to introduce yourself, I guess, for the record.
Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Stacy Spann, Executive Director of Housing Opportunities Commission.
Great. And so that program, the counseling, the HOC counseling program, what's the scale of that? How many people are you impacting, and has it been effective?
Well, it's effective for sure, and there are really two pieces of it. So there's the sort of public-facing part that we're talking about right now, but there's also the internal discussion that happens because HOC itself is a landlord. And so the resident services team and Fred Swan, who's the director of that team, is here as well. There's the public-facing part that deals with sort of a smaller number of folks. And even across the HOC properties, it's a relatively small number of folks. But the fact is that they're staving off eviction and other activities because they're advocating for those persons who are in jeopardy.
And one of the recommendations from the report was that we, try to intervene earlier on. And I'm wondering, do we at DHCA, is there any pre-counseling programs that we do that might be similarly or modeled at that for non-HOC properties, just normal properties?
Sure. Most of the financial literacy educational outreach is more geared towards the home ownership side. However, we are looking into putting that together also for the rental side. I think what this excellent report has done is really highlighted the need to get on the preventive end. That's when you can save the most money and help the most people. So we're going to look at some in-house training initiatives and also potentially take a look at some contractual help.
Well, keep in touch on that. I think that's critical. The sooner we can do that, the better, especially in light of Councilmember Alvernaz's point of where we are right now, and I'm sure that's the trend line. So thank you. Absolutely. Thank you both.
Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just wanted to highlight a few points, and I had a few questions. I think Councilmember Alvernaz raised the issue of the shutdown, which not only has direct impacts, but I think it shines a light to the broader comments that were made, I think originally by Chairman Reamer, about how many people are on the margins and how many folks, one or two paychecks can be the difference between making rent and not, between putting food on the table and not. And I think this really puts that into focus, and in the backdrop of the government shutdown, we really see that, and it really does highlight it. And I think the other piece of this is increasingly important, is the idea that our county is getting more and more of renters versus homeowners, and that percentage is growing and has grown for many years, and I think is going to continue to grow. And so I appreciate hearing the fact that there's an interest at DHCA to focus some of the educational, financial education programs and outreach towards renters, not just homeowners, because I think that is the area of growth, and that's the area that more and more of our folks are renters. And so I want to make sure, and I hope that we make sure in that particular area, but in the broader area, that we not only don't lose sight of renters making up such a large portion of our population, but that we really double down on it and really emphasize it, and ensure that we're focused on it, because I think that is not going to change based on the cost of living here, based on global economic trends of how long people stay in jobs and how comfortable they are with it. And I'm a huge believer in home ownership. I hope as many people who want it achieve it, and I'm a proud homeowner in Montgomery County, but we don't represent homeowners, we represent residents, and some residents, and an increasing share are renters, and some are homeowners. And I hope as we can take a broader view as we move forward and focus on those issues. I did have a couple questions. One is when we're specifically talking about the 1750, and I just want to make sure I understand where all these buckets of money are coming from. Is that money coming from the rental assistance in large part or in partial part from the premium on recordation taxes that's being paid for over $500,000? I know a portion of the premium, the recordation tax premium over $500,000 goes to rental assistance. Is that what we're talking about here for emergency assistance?
It's actually a combination of rental assistance dollars. We partner with DHCA on that. But there's a secondary piece, which is in county general funds, which is separate from that recordation.
Got it. And any idea of what percentage the two buckets are?
Yeah, we have about $1 million that we get from DHCA and about $1.3 million in emergency services dollars for financial assistance that lives in the HHS budget itself.
Great. And how, we had an earlier conversation today in the GEO committee, and one of the things that was a particular concern to me was that the earned income tax credit, the refundable earned income tax credit, we have a county match of that program, and we're not hitting that number. And so unfortunately, that was $500,000 in the savings plan, was just by virtue of the fact that people had not achieved it. Now, I don't think that's because people don't need it or aren't eligible for it. I think that we haven't found those folks. I was curious, you said it sounds like 2.3 million total in this program. How close are we to giving out all of that rental assistance on an annual basis?
We are on target to spend all of our dollars.
Good. So you're asking for more is what I'm hearing. Okay, well, that's at least encouraging that we're reaching that number. It'd be interesting to know if, whether there was a greater demand for it and a requirement for more funding for this particular program, which seems to be, one area of many areas where we need to take a look, particularly, in light of the government shutdown, and, there may be more of a need for rental assistance. And as a lot of us have had individual conversations of how limited we are, unfortunately, with how we fill that gap, but perhaps that's one area that we could take a look at to see if, perhaps there could be supplemental appropriation or some other funding to help folks during this period of time to address it. And then you mentioned the state share of that. What percentage of that total program would be state emergency assistance?
So the state funds are actually separate from those numbers that I gave you. That comes to us as part of our HB 669 block grant. And those benefits are actually, and that the budget for that, I think this year, I'd have to verify, I think it's about $775,000.
Great.
That's it for, they're just for client benefit.
And do we come close to spending the full balance of those funds, or how does that work?
We're close. Those dollars we draw down on, they're not as flexible, so even though the need is there, we're not always able to draw down on them when we want to, and that's largely related to state policy and procedure.
Great, thank you. One last piece of this, and I want to echo my colleagues of how thorough and helpful this report was, and applaud your work and OLO in general for really helping us to contextualize this broader issue. In looking at the report and in your recommendations, which I agree wholeheartedly, these are really important and good policy areas to pursue, both the state advocacy with pre-filing notice, which seems like an interesting area to focus on, but then also areas that we can do in terms of earlier intervention. But just speaking to what Councilmember Jawanda was highlighting with the targeted areas, not just style of apartments, but particular problem apartments. My belief is, particularly on this, the vast majority of renters are good renters. The vast majority of landlords are good landlords. There are some renters who take advantage of the property and don't handle it in the right way, and there are some landlords who take advantage of it. And I think that it's important that we talk about this issue in that way, and this particularly calls out 64% of the evictions were from 22% of the properties. I mean, that is a pretty obvious area, and to me calls out for a scalpel and not a hatchet in terms of our policy prescriptions. And so one area is in dealing with the landlords, not even on the enforcement side, which I think is important, and we ought to, to benefit the residents and the other good landlords, by the way, of making sure that the landlords who aren't playing by the rules and aren't investing in their properties and aren't doing the things that they ought to be doing, that they are, but also in doing some literacy programs and working with the landlords as well, because obviously the way that tenants are being brought in, the way that rent is being collected, the way that information is going, if they're having repeated evictions, that's not just because there are a large number of folks in that particular area that happen not to be able to make payment. Obviously, there's an issue on the front end of bringing in tenants, either from a lack of information or from some, whatever the case may be. I don't know what it is, or repeated raising of rents that is costing them money as well and displacing families. And so I think there could be an education piece as well for them, on both sides of this area to address that, because clearly we're talking about a small number of properties and a large number of the total evictions.
Thank you. We have started looking at properties that have a large number of evictions, properties that are increasing their rents, and see if there's a correlation between rent increases and evictions, if it's property management, what's going on to cause those evictions in those type of properties. We're also going to be looking at, can we correlate the information from our Housing Code Enforcement section with our Office from our Landlord Tenant section. See, just like you were saying, if there's a lot of complaints in one place, what are the complaints and what can we do to start solving that problem early on in the process? Because we all agree that preventing the eviction early on is the best way to solve it.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's all I have, and just the broader question of how do we really focus on a population that's growing and make sure that the education and the outreach dollars that we're investing in the programs that we have are focused on both ends of this. This is a costly endeavor for everybody involved, the landlord, the tenant, and the county, when we're dealing with, a huge number of evictions, and obviously nobody wants to get there. And so anything that we can do as early on as possible to focus on it would be extremely helpful. So thank you.
Thank you. Can we talk a little bit about opportunities to enhance the HHS programs? Have we already covered that, or were there some specific, ideas that you had that we can talk through with HHS here?
Sure, so our specific recommendation was to start by collecting data, and I'd like to turn over to my colleagues from HHS to discuss that area, because I think that would really inform any further decisions that are made.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Sure. So yes, we have data. All the data elements that you recommended, we are now able to track. We, at the time that we were collecting information for the report, we had only been using our integrated case management tool for a short period of time. We didn't have enough data in there to actually analyze. So now we have that data. So we are able to look at age, race, gender, income level, repeat customers. We are also in the process of doing an analysis between those households that are seeking prevention and who is entering our homeless continuum, and trying to figure out what could we be doing differently to engage the folks that actually end up in our homeless shelters before they get to that point. On its face, I can certainly follow up with a more detailed analysis. We're in the midst of it. But what I will say is there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of difference from a gender, race perspective between the households that are receiving prevention assistance and those that enter the homeless continuum. They look the same. So that's both good and bad. It doesn't give us any additional information or steer us to target in a different way. But
what is it that you were hoping that data will help us understand?
Sure, so from our perspective, having data would help us to understand whether the program is reaching its intended population. So making sure that the zip codes where folks are receiving assistance is matching up with where evictions are occurring.
Okay, so that's sort of a measure of our effectiveness at being where the problem is most significant.
Yes, go ahead.
it does.
And it matches.
Yes, it does match.
Okay.
Which is also good news.
Another measure that some jurisdictions track is repeat assistance, so that helps us to understand whether people are coming back each year for assistance, or whether they're really only using the program one time. And is that something that you?
Yeah, those are all things that we're looking at. For us, the data is important so that we can determine how best to target our resources. The scope of the issue is huge. Nearly half of all renters in the county are housing burdened, meaning that they pay more than 30% of their income on housing. So we have a pot of money, and we have to figure out how do we most effectively serve those that are most at risk, if that's the way we want to target. The problem is grand.
So now you have a data system that you've built as a result of the interactions for this report, it sounds like. You somewhat, or perhaps, it doesn't matter. You've got a data system that you've built, and and you'll be able to work from there and identify opportunities to do more, to do it better, to enhance, to target more effectively. So we will hear more from you about that. How do you respond to the need to work on the high-rent, high-eviction multifamily properties? Is that, you mentioned it, but can you just state what your thinking is here?
Sure. I've already started looking at, from our licensing section, information on rent increases each year, and from each property, rents and then increases to the next year, and tracking which properties are doing rent increases and how that tracks over time. I thought I'd see a clear picture, and I don't, so I need to start really looking down and seeing what properties are raising rents and what's going on there. Then we're going to try and compare and look at our landlord-tenant information, see if we're getting consistent complaints from certain properties, and just try and see how the information meshes together. Then we'll work also on looking at the properties that are serving a lot of evictions, obtaining a lot of evictions, and start looking at what the characteristics are of those type of properties.
Right. So you're doing a lot of work around rent and rent increases at this time, data work.
That's the starting point, because there are concerns that it's rent increases that are causing evictions. So if that's been raised as a concern, we want to see, is the data there to support it? Or is there something else going on? Is it that half the households are rent burdened, and it's a matter of needing to work with tenants up front on financial literacy and other issues to help them prevent getting in that trap? Are there other programs or initiatives we can set up to help families with children, families that are, example I keep hearing from folks are families that are, households that are on types of services or financial assistance where they get paid in the middle of the month, not at the beginning of the month? And are there ways that we can develop some systematic changes and programs that help certain segments of the population that we identify through this analysis?
Okay, and how do you respond to the idea of addressing the plain language lease summary and how we could clarify some of the issues?
We've already worked on that. We have a draft of what it would look like. It's minor tweaks. We still need to fly it by the county attorney's office to confirm that they agree with it. But we've added a couple of statements that I think reflect the request.
Okay, and we had the suggestion about a court navigator or legal assistance. So where do we address that to?
That would be.
One thing that I would like to point out, I mean, I think being on the ground is probably going to be the most helpful type of service that you could provide, but there is service provided. The Maryland Courts Self-Help Center, it's a call-in number. There's walk-in centers in Baltimore City, Glen Burnie, Upper Marlboro, and Salisbury, clearly not Rockville, but there is some assistance available, so you can call in, or it's online. I'm not sure how helpful it is, and again...
Right. I mean, one of the things that stuck out to me was court navigation. The idea that you have many people showing up in court with no one to help explain what's happening to them that day or what resources might be available to them, that would be an area where, you know, we might be able to really make a difference and help people through in the crisis.
One thing that we need to do better, I think, which is apparent, is kind of get into the data to understand how to prevent the evictions. And one of the things is you have 10,000 writs. Okay, where are they? When are they? Getting to that level of detail. And so what we're going to do is assign a specific landlord-tenant staff to work on evictions and kind of get to the bottom of the data to get to the more helpful places. And one other thing that is in the works is we're hiring a tenant advocate. I'm not sure exactly where we are in the OHR process, but should be available on staff in the next few months.
Okay. That's helpful. So you're working on it. You're definitely working on it. And I guess we'll see what you've got in motion when we come back through the budget review for DHCA. We'll get an update at that time, if not sooner.
Sorry, I would like to weigh in on that, if that's...
Please, join the conversation.
So just from what we see on the ground as folks who are coming through the door, going through the eviction process, it is confusing and complicated, and people don't always know what their rights are. And, you know, the education is great, but, you know, in court, on day of, as they're working through this process, having someone to guide them, I think would be so helpful. We work with, we see a lot of folks with limited English proficiency. We see a lot of folks who, English may be their first language, and they may not have a lot of educational attainment, and the language, court systems language is not customer friendly. I also think there's opportunities as we work through this to make sure that the information that the landlord is filing is accurate and people understand that they themselves have a side and can help defend themselves and make the case.
Or even that they can negotiate.
And that they can negotiate.
That struck me as
'Cause
really...
that's, rather than have them go through this entire process, if we can make this earlier on, so I would be
keep it off
really
of their record, so to speak.
Absolutely.
That they have a chance to come out of this yet. It's not too late.
Yeah, so I do think it would be really interested to look at what might make sense here, because I do really think that the residents could really benefit from that kind of, legal assistance.
So we should be, we should be talking about that. Figure out maybe that may just be a pure public safety committee item since it's court navigation. I still want to ask another question, but if you wanted to just chime in on that issue, please.
Yeah, well, to me, and it's certainly something that should be a public safety item, and we certainly need to discuss it. But to me, the day that someone's in court is probably we should be discussing this way before it gets to court. And that, to me, is the significant part. When you were saying that someone, you might come to you with $7,000 worth of needs, that's more than 1 month. So if they would have come earlier on, when their $1,700 could keep them in that home, that would have been a huge help. I agree that we need at the far end, we need the public, the assistance for a court, but we need to be doing something way in advance of that. And the other thing is, when you're talking about the income, we're talking about 30%. Well, that's 30% of someone's gross. That's not 30% of someone's net. And people have, many other expenses that if they get sick or they have car repairs or whatever, they're in huge trouble. So therefore and then the other thing that I think that we should look into is that even though these are some high-risk apartments and whatnot that are causing the most of it, are those landlords in some ways being helpful, that they're allowing someone in that home that someone else, another landlord, might not allow in that home? And so therefore, yes, they're having higher evictions, but, they're trying to, what I'm trying to say. And so I think we need to look at all of that. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, last item, then we have a few more questions, and then we'll close up this discussion. Regarding this issue of the pre-filing notice. So, I've heard from some property owners that they communicate assiduously with their tenants when they don't pay. Like, there's no lack of notification to the tenant that the check has not been received. What is the distinction here between a pre-filing and what is the benefit of pre-filing if a landlord is notifying the tenant, hey, we haven't received your payment, what's going on?
Sure, so the discussion question is about making it required, and as part of that requirement, for example, in Virginia, and perhaps Stephanie can speak to this, there is a specific text, right, that they have to provide.
Sure. So the state of Virginia requires a 5-day pay or quit notice. And so it's a letter that the landlord provides to the tenant that says how much rent is owed. It says if you don't pay rent by a certain date, you owe this much. If it calculates the late fees, if that was also there too, so the tenant can easily see what is being paid. And then it also says if you don't pay by this date, they will be taken to court. So it lays it out a little more clearly, but it also requires landlords to provide that, where not every landlord might be as communicative with their tenants.
It's a sense of urgency. All right. Yeah.
Okay, I've got Gabe and Will.
Sorry, last comment for now. So putting on my HHS hat, and I appreciate you guys being at the table, clearly there's a mental health toll for folks that in fact are evicted, and that disproportionately impacts children. What interventions are in place? Are there interventions in place when an eviction happens? Is there a referral process that occurs that provides some level of support? Because clearly a family is in crisis if they're in that situation to begin with.
Yes, and we're an integrated department, so we work very closely with our partners in behavioral health and child welfare. so everyone is given, when people come into our system, we conduct a screening for other needs on all customers that come to us. And that helps us identify what are the other areas that they could benefit from some assistance. So we do it in that way. And then also just recognizing this person is in crisis, let's make sure that we do a warm handoff and get them connected to services. So that is an integral part of HHS and what we do.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is probably for our OLO folks and maybe for DHCA. You had mentioned some prevention programs or assistance programs, rather, where they had payment plans or they would lengthen the amount of time within a month. And I'm particularly thinking of, when we went to that chart of when the eviction process starts, 10 days, you get the notice on the 11th day sometime, and going. Are there examples that you looked at across the country in other jurisdictions where there was more flexibility within the 30 days and that the government was involved in providing that flexibility? And then the secondary question is, have we explored any of those options?
In terms of payment plans?
Yes.
So we had not come over across examples of that in other jurisdictions. What we did come across on examples is places that Durham County has an eviction diversion program, whereas they actually attach to the complaint that is served to the tenant the number to call for social services, and then they link them in either to emergency financial assistance or legal assistance.
So it's kind of given right at the point.
It's given at the point that it's posted or served to the property or the tenant. But I could turn it over to DHC to answer.
Have we done have we explored those types of options? Do you have authority to do it? Do you need us to help? I think that's a great idea, just number one. But are there other things you're thinking about as you're looking at this issue?
Sure. So one of the programs that we were on that provides the financial assistance is our homelessness prevention program. It's budgeted at around, I guess, $280,000. I think the actual need per year, closer to $300,000, $400,000. Average assistance is right around the $1,000 range. Max is $1,500. It can be increased to $2,500 at the discretion of the housing chief. Again, if we are there early on, we're able to help more. If it's I'm being evicted tomorrow, I need help, we're limited. Now, we do have relationships with our landlords because, we have a tenant landlord section. And so if we have good relationship with that landlord, we can provide a certain guarantee that, the system takes a little while to get you the money, but we can make you whole. We're working through the process. Now, as a part of that program, there's certain preventative measures, and it's a one-time type assistance. But that's one of the ways that we help.
We can explore, that's helpful for both of you, and we can explore other ways. I'm just thinking in this whole time period, obviously we all want to do the prevention piece, but when you're in that, when the rubber hits the road and you're in that month and you, like these people on Friday who know that they're not going to be able to pay next month, what can we do to provide flexibility within the 30-day period? Were you going to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is part of what we do in our housing stabilization services. So even though we are limited in the financial resources that we can give to people, so right now we do require people to have some sort of, the landlord needs to file, right? There needs to be some documentation. Documentation of an emergency. But that doesn't mean that you can't receive services from our social workers, our case managers, to do that counseling and to do that negotiation with the landlord to try and prevent the eviction. So we are doing some of that work. I think the other important point to mention is that even if we do extensive outreach, which I think we should, and we should make sure that people are aware of our services, for folks that are experiencing a crisis or are living paycheck to paycheck, it's hard for them. It's hard for their brain to actually think about long term. Yeah. So oftentimes people do just put their head in the sand and they come to us that day, right? And it's just something for us to be aware of.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. I think it's time to move to our next discussion. So we'll keep working on this issue and look forward to hearing more from everybody as we proceed. Thank you. Thank you, OLO. And DHCA, you'll remain there. And I understand that we have the chief attorney at Maryland Legal Aid here today. Could you join us? And we'll ask Aoba to join us.
I like this public safety PHED team.
Yeah.
Good team.
Well, it should have been more public safety than PHED, but I'm just saying. Tom wasn't here, so you all won 3-2.
Where is Tom?
Tom is out of town.
Yeah, he's on travel. I don't know.
Travel. This is like, seems like his alley.
Yeah. What's that? All right, everybody. We're now going to have a discussion on a state bill that has been introduced by Delegate Janelle Wilkins, who I imagine is watching now. Hi, Janelle. And we have an amendment, or a couple of amendments from Janelle we've received to her own bill. They're her own amendments. So those have been passed around. There may be a stack over there if you're interested. We'll go through them if necessary during the course of the discussion. I have asked the Chief of Maryland Legal Aid, John Marshall, to sit with us, as well as AOBA, the Office and Apartment Building Owners, and perhaps there'll be others who we need to call upon. We have a good room here, full room today. But why don't we turn it to our council staff, Linda McMillan, and she can walk us through the memorandum that kind of walks through the issue.
Yes, so this is an opportunity for the Joint Committee to have a discussion about this bill. As you previously mentioned, the council meets in whole to really decide whether to take a position on a bill or to ask for amendments. So this is your opportunity to consider some of the issues in the Just Cause eviction bill, and then give direction to staff if there are issues that you'd like to have language on or further take to the council, and then we would arrange for that during your state legislative session. So as background, I did just want to say, and you had heard from Delegate Wilkins earlier, and she had provided quite a bit of background information related to the bill. That's included in your packet. She has recently sent a letter with a couple of amendments, some of which were actually identified earlier, but there is one that will be pertinent to some of the items that are listed in the packet. So in your packet, you have the information from Delegate Wilkins, which includes a just cause eviction fact sheet and her interim study. The testimony that is related to the bill that was from Mr. Hall of SEIU, and then the council also received an email of support from the Women's Democratic Club. I just want to be clear that the bill actually doesn't change anything about the eviction process other than it changes the reasons that you could ask for an eviction due to holdover. So the sort of days and all that kind of stuff that you've been going through and the need for court assistance, that really doesn't change for somebody who would go into the eviction process. It changes the people who could go into the eviction process. So OLO actually did have some information in their report about just cause eviction, and I did just include that in the packet for you for background. And I want to say before talking about the specific topic, discussion topics that I've kind of outlined, that Delegate Wilkins' information does a really good job of explaining, how important it is for tenants. This is their home. They're a renter, but it's their home. How important it is for people to feel like they have stability in their home, and that they're not sort of, you know, worried all the time of, am I going to have to move, am I going to have to move, am I going to have to move? So that is like a really important part of just cause eviction. That is what you have to balance with the considerations of the landlord, and there are landlords that have, there are landlords of just 1 or 2 units, or maybe just, you know, the rooms in their house, to very large landlords. But the consideration is a landlord and a tenant right now have entered into a contract, they've entered into a lease, and right now at the end of that contract, if the landlord decides that they don't wish to renew that for another period, if they've met all their obligations, they don't have to give the tenant a reason, right? So the tenant could have met all their rent, could have met everything, and the landlord decides they don't wish to renew that tenant that wishes to hold over. And so there is no requirement for a just cause. So this is, just cause eviction is an effort to balance providing stability and certainty to tenants, especially to good tenants who are, you know, keeping up their properties, keeping up with their rent, doing all that so that they know that they can stay in their home with some adjustments, balancing that with how landlords wish to manage the properties that they own. Just cause eviction is in many jurisdictions. It's not in every jurisdiction. It is in many jurisdictions. It does have to be done at the state level here, which is why you're talking about state legislation as opposed to county legislation. And so what I've done for you just in the packet is to raise some issues with you for discussion to think about in terms of whether you might ask for amendments or not, or your overall support of the bill. And I'll just, if it's okay, maybe just to go through those, and then we would hear from people at the table. So actually, why don't we do introductions at the table so then people can weigh in as they see fit? Is that okay?
My name is John Marshall. I'm the chief attorney at the Legal Aid Office here in Montgomery County.
Hi, Tim Getzinger, acting director of DHCA.
Rosie McCray Moody, Manager, Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs.
Nicola Whiteman, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the Apartment and Office Building Association.
Gabrielle Duval, Southern Management Corporation. We hold 4,400 apartments in this area.
Okay. You'll need to use your mic when you do speak, but...
Thank you. I'm Caroline Elmendorf, Senior Compliance Officer for Bethesda Management.
So the first issue that I raise is what units should the law apply to? And in this case, in just looking at it, also from the ease of certainty for enforceability by DHCA, I've suggested that it would be helpful that the bill actually says that it's licensed units as opposed to leased premises. And so the bill currently says a leased premises means a dwelling unit that's subject to a residential lease. Every tenant, we encourage every tenant to have a lease, whether they are in an apartment or whether they are renting a room. It's always good for tenants to have a lease. It's always good for landlords to have a lease. You can have, in some instances, verbal leases, but generally leases in apartments are written leases. We have model leases and requirements for people who are licensed. But you also have people who wish to share their home or to rent out a bedroom. I think it would just be cleaner. There could be some discussion about whether that constitutes a unit and so might not already be subject to this bill. But I think that the county licenses specific kinds of rental units, and that it would be cleaner, since this is a Montgomery County only bill, to have the bill be the subject of the units would be units that have a Montgomery County rental license. And so that does include multifamily units, it includes single family rentals, and it includes accessory dwelling units. And I'm just offering that just for ease of being certain as to which units we're talking about when we look at compliance.
Okay. Very good. Any comments from the panel on that particular issue? Recognizing this doesn't, you haven't made a recommendation on the overall bill. This is a specific recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
Just to give you a numbers idea, there's about 125 to 130 rental units in the county. We license 100,000, a little bit more, probably about 103, but just round numbers, 100,000, 70,000 multifamily, 20,000 single family, 10,000 are rental condos. And then in terms of the accessory units, there's about 400 that we license. So that just gives you an idea. In terms of the multifamily units, so we license 70,000. There's probably closer to 85 to 90,000 total multifamily units in the county. We don't license properties that are in Tacoma Park or Gaithersburg or Rockville. So I just want to make sure that you understand.
I should disclose that of those 10,000 condo rentals, 2 belong to my wife and myself. I think it's necessary for me to disclose that. I don't believe I have a conflict of interest.
Have you paid your fee?
I will say I'm new to this process. We started this year, and it's been interesting to learn how to go through these processes as a landlord.
I'll give you my card.
Thanks. I believe I've paid my fee. Yes.
And so again, since we're having this discussion, it may be important to make sure that we're not just talking about licensed units that the county does, but within the municipalities as well. So we could clarify that. Okay.
Okay, so any comments on that general question of whether what units the law should apply to? Recognizing again that the committee's not taking a position on the bill itself. I think your recommendation sounds reasonable.
And so this one actually, Delegate Wilkins in her memo that was just handed out does start, it addresses this question that I asked about, should the bill apply to landlords with only one licensed unit? And so the question I had in terms of this balance is that, especially, accessory dwelling units, we have people that have one unit. It's true that you could have somebody who has one unit that's a home that they may have moved out of and kept as a rental, but you do have people who just have like one or, a very small number of units, but in particular one unit. And so the question was, should the bill apply to landlords with only one licensed unit? I would note that the fourth bullet down in Amendment Number 2 in Delegate Wilkins' memo I just handed out says create an exemption for an owner-occupied property where the landlord rents just one unit. And so that would address the accessory dwelling unit situation.
Right. So Delegate Wilkins has announced that she's amending her own bill or recommending amending her own bill to not cover one unit.
Right. And I want to just say that this is sort of a balance, because I don't want to imply that the housing stability for the person living in a one unit is any less valid than for somebody living in a multifamily. But I think as we're trying to balance off encouraging, frankly, people to become small landlords, to have an ADU, to do those kinds of things, it takes a little bit of a burden off of that.
Go ahead.
Yeah. What I think what she's saying is an owner-occupied property that where the landlord rents just one unit. But if the owner does not live in that property, that would still be under this.
It would. So this would address an accessory dwelling unit, right?
Right. There's a difference,
right.
yeah.
But it would not address if I've moved out of a home, I rent the whole home, and then I live in another home.
That would still be under.
That would still be, it would be a little different to say that it's a landlord of only one unit, right?
Yeah.
So for example, you move,
right,
and you decide to keep your first
home,
house,
and you're going to rent
under this.
You're
right,
covered
so
by this.
Right, so that would not be covered by her amendment, but the issue of an accessory dwelling unit would be.
Right, because it's owner occupied.
Right.
Or I should say, the accessory dwelling unit, if it is owner occupied. The current code requires it to be owner occupied.
The property is the property's owner occupied.
The property is.
Yeah.
Right, and in that same case, if someone rents a room in their own home, the way she's suggesting this, it's owner occupied in one unit. If they're renting one room, would that would not be covered? But if they're renting two rooms,
well, so Linda,
okay,
okay,
we're doing only licensed units. A room rental is not licensed or licensable. We don't do room rentals.
So you don't inspect if someone is renting out rooms. We don't inspect
if somebody calls in and says the landlord turned off the heat, code would go out. But they couldn't file a complaint with landlord tenant because we don't cover that. Because we only cover units that are licensed or licensable.
So the first issue that I raised, which is if you change the definition to having the units be licensed, then if you rent out a bedroom in your house that you are living in and you're sharing everything else, so you're just renting out a bedroom, there's no license required, this would not apply to that. The just cause eviction, if you were to ask the delegate to amend it that way, if it were amended to be based on a license. Because if somebody just renting out a bedroom is not required to have a license.
But if it's more than a single bedroom, if they're renting out two rooms, are they still not required? You're saying that they're not required at all, is that correct?
No.
You're just not required to have a license.
If they live there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're not renting, and it's not more than 500 persons?
Right.
They don't require a license.
Okay, all right.
Okay. All right, so we are talking about should the bill apply to landlords with only one licensed unit?
Which is slightly different from the amendment that she is saying she's moving forward with.
So I guess I'll just say, I think my concern about having it apply to only landlords who only have one licensed unit is people might be reluctant to get into the sector of renting out a property, and we need a rental market just as we need an ownership market, and I'm a little concerned that, that it's just a higher threshold for someone to have to go to court in these circumstances, and it just may not be, for an owner who is just a homeowner with one property. They're not big investors. They don't have a big budget necessarily to handle that. So I worry about sending them towards the legal system as owners just as much as I am concerned about their rights as tenants. So it's just a tricky issue. Comments if you wish. You don't have to. Okay, Andrew's first, and then, well.
Yeah, I just wanted to hop on that. I'm just curious. I know there are some jurisdictions where 4 or more units is a different threshold of a landlord. I think DC, it's 4 or more. That's viewed very differently. So that would, I thought that was total units, not in the same building. But that would, and maybe AOBA or somebody who is more regional could help me out here. But yeah.
Yeah, I was saying, the 4 or less units is the threshold for determining applicability for rent control. So if you have a smaller number of units, I mean, it's an affirmative step that you have to take. You are then exempt. It's essentially called the small housing provider exemption. And there are other areas of the DC code where certain laws, and that's probably the most well-known example, where certain laws are applicable based on the size of the property or the number of units that an owner or manager owns or operates.
Yeah, it would seem to me, I mean, just to Hans's point, it would make sense to differentiate because I guess in full disclosure, I also own my first 685 square foot. I am current, on a really small original condo. I currently live in my condo that I live in now, but I think that's quite different. And I think, in terms of the threshold of what the capacity is and the interest and the ability and the sophistication of a couple or an individual or a family who decides to keep the unit they move out of. Sometimes it's because your family circumstance changes, but the real estate market is not in a good environment to sell. And so if you are able to carry 2 places and you can easily rent it out, and so, I mean, I think there are reasons for that. And I think if we are to go down this path, and I don't know if there are other issues that this would raise, but I do think that adopting a standard, and 4 is a reasonable number. To me, there could be a higher number, a lower number, but I think we ought to look at, state.
Only add, I don't believe the district makes a distinction, and I'm not suggesting one way or the other size, in terms of the eviction rules and laws apply to all. There's no distinction between, and also very different, you know, it's a just cause eviction with rent control, and the issue, just, you know, for the record, but the issue of number of units, there's no distinction in the eviction code for based on, like, if you have 5 units, 6 units, 10 units, so just, if that's the comparison.
Well, I just was thinking, you know, I was sensitive to Hans's point. You know, aren't we saying an ADU is different because that's a different type of landlord, and so we're parsing that out, which, you know, seems to make sense to me. And, you know, a lot of times in an ADU, there's a different relationship. This could be in-laws, this could be parents, this could be, you know, adult age, you know, children. I mean, there could be a totally different dynamic, or it could be people who you don't know that you're trying to be able to stay in your home, that you otherwise couldn't be able to afford to continue to live in a very expensive place to live. But it would seem to me if we were making that distinction for the ADU because of this idea that it's a different type of landlord, that it would make sense to broaden that out a little bit.
If I can address that point, I would just say that the issue that comes up a lot with just cause bills, and they tend to be linked majority in jurisdictions with rent control, which is not an issue here. The empirical data put forth in the excellent OLO report we heard about earlier indicates this is not a pervasive problem in the county. So you're talking about really an anecdotal problem we're trying to solve through legislation. When you parse out the small, uneducated, unsophisticated landlords who may not be as well-versed and have fair housing training and have retaliatory eviction training and may not have the resources and training necessary to operate a fair and safe housing community the way the larger landlords do, you're essentially parsing out of the bill the very people that you're trying to protect against. And if this is truly an education standpoint and a standpoint of trying to protect people from unjust evictions, it's not the large landlords that are doing this, and that's not what the anecdotal evidence supports or the empirical data.
Fair point. John, you said you looked like you wanted to speak according to Mr.
I'm concerned that you all have lost the forest for the trees here a little bit, which is this bill, if either one of you rents your home, you're the one that you've just vacated, or the apartment that you bought, to an individual under a lease, then the only way you get that person out is through the legal system. So, and if the lease is expired, you still have to file a tenant holding over action. This bill doesn't change that. The only thing this bill is set to change is that you have to provide a reason. And if one of those reasons, as an example, is you want to sell your apartment or your condo or your house now, that is fair game. That's good cause. So the problem is, and I think what Delegate Wilkins is trying to address, is for those people who have no lease, through no fault often of their own, and I can go into that, where they've been told, now you have to move, and the landlord has to give no excuse, no reason at all. And this is a person who may have been living there for a long time. And then what do? Why are they being thrown out? They've paid their rent, they've maintained the property. What's the problem? Well, and what Delegate Wilkins is saying is if you're going to sell it, or if you're going to have your family move in because that's an accommodation for your family, that's all good cause. But if it's just because they looked at you crosswise, or you went to Ms. Moody's office and complained, or you went to the landlord himself and complained about the condition, and then they decide to throw you out because there's no lease, that's unfair to these tenants. And that's the only change in the law. So it does not affect, nothing of what you, Mr. Reimer or Mr. Friedson said is applicable to this bill.
Thank you, John. All right, we've got some, are you your light on?
I didn't
Yeah.
turn on just quick,
Go ahead.
Very quick. Thank you. So, just to be clear, currently,
Your mic is not on.
yeah, I'm on the wish to speak. Just to be clear, currently the covered under this leased premises, say it to me one more time. Who's covered under the current way this bill is written?
It's any unit that's subject to a residential lease.
Okay, great. And a unit subject, there was a little ambiguity, it seemed from you. What units are covered under residential lease?
Are units that are licensed licensable, which actually includes the accessory units.
So it does include the accessory units, okay. And it would also include my colleague's units.
Yeah.
So
But
single,
it wouldn't include a room rental if he just rented a.
if you're owner occupied,
Yeah.
right. But if you're not in the, you don't live there personally as the landlord, then it applies. It's a licensable or, okay, so all those would count. So you're renting out a condo, you're anything, you're an individual person, you're not a big management company. Applies to big and small alike. Okay, so we've established, I just wanted to, that's what I understood, but I just wanted to make sure. To your point, if the term of the lease ends, under current law, you wouldn't have to, you could just say, hey, I'm leaving. I'm leaving as the landlord, I'm leaving as the tenant. Either side, can depart at that point without a penalty, right? As opposed to if you were breaking your lease, there's a penalty, associated with that, right? This would change it so that absent one of these causes, the landlord would not be able to evict the tenant at the end of the lease term, correct? That's what we're talking about here.
Oh, a tenant holding over action only exists when there is no lease in existence. It has expired for whatever reason.
Right.
Now, I represent, at Legal Aid, we represent those who are the most vulnerable in our community. And there are many other stories, and there are many other relationships between landlord and tenant other than the ones that we see regularly. Where we see the problem that this bill addresses is that we have tenants, usually with subsidized housing through HOC or otherwise, who have been in a place, a house, townhouse, condo, whatever it might be, apartment, for a long period of time. Understand that when you sign your lease initially, you have to have a 2-year, they have to extend you a 2-year lease. But what we see are landlords who refuse to offer a lease again. And I've seen clients who've been in a place for over 20 years, and then the landlord comes to them and says, get out. And so the question has to be asked, and I think this bill does this, is why would a landlord not issue a lease? Now, there are many reasons. One of them may be, I don't want to continue this lease, I don't want to continue this relationship with this tenant. But when it's after 20 years, and 18 of which there's been no lease, one has to ask the question, why? Was it because the tenant wanted it that way, and they wanted it because they had 1 foot out the door always? They had that flexibility. My clients, that's not the case. They can't afford to move every 2 years. That may be true with tenants who have more wealth, but it is not true with my clients. So the question becomes, why? And I can only tell you from my client's perspective, and it is limited, is that it gives the landlord obviously the most amount of flexibility, but it also suppresses dissent from the tenant, because there's always the threat that if you open your mouth, you're gone. It also bypasses the failure to pay rent laws, because instead of having to have 3 FTPRs in a year, if you haven't paid your rent, instead of going through a failure to pay rent process, you can say, oh, good, I don't have a lease. You don't have a lease, you're out. All of those things, and all of those things are true, and the tenant has no defense today to a tenant holding over case. None. The only defense under state law is if the tenant complains to Ms. Moody or to some other agency, and within 6 months of that complaint, there is an effort to move that tenant out, then there's a claim for retaliatory eviction. Other than that, the tenant is entirely defenseless. And what this bill is trying to do is to level that playing field. I think that's all it's trying to do.
Appreciate it.
But in response to that, what the numbers bear out, as evidenced by the OLO report, this is not a significant or pervasive problem in the county. Out of the 4,411 units that Southern Management owns, we filed less than 15 tenant holding over actions last year. Of those 15, we actually prosecuted 8 of them. The reasons we file, and what I need to overwhelmingly state as an owner-operator who holds property in the county and does not flip, we're not developers, we are part of the fabric of this community. As owner-operators, We want tenants who stay and pay. Our goal, economically and socially, are tenants who stay in our buildings. We throw parties for our long-term residents. And we do this because, quite candidly, it is very expensive to go through the eviction process. It is very expensive to turn over a unit, and it is very expensive to fill vacancies in a tough and oversaturated market. So there is a fallacy to the premise that we are looking to kick innocent people out. What we're looking to do is provide market rate affordable housing and provide those people in our housing units a safe and clean place to call home. Yeah. We cannot provide a safe and clean place to go call home if I can't kick out someone who is suspected of potential gang activity, which has happened at one of our buildings.
Let me just stop you there, because I've lived in the Southern Management property at the Claridge House. I had a great time. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
But I think saying that it's not a significant problem, it's significant for the people who were removed. And when you use the phrase kick out, the language you're using, it troubles me a little bit about the way you're talking about it. And if the numbers are so insignificant, then what's the problem?
You raise a fair point, and I will address, I apologize for my colloquial language. And the problem here is providing our residents a safe and clean place to live. If there is someone who is suspected of illegal drug use, someone who is harassing residents, someone who is suspecting of running a prostitution ring in our buildings, and all of these things have happened in Montgomery County and our communities.
You call the police, right?
You call the police, and if the police don't see it, if the police don't have empirical data, they don't issue a citation at every turn. The police force does an incredible job in Montgomery County. They're as overtaxed as anyone else, and they're not there to police our communities. That's our job, and that's our job as a management company. And so what we're trying to do is to ask those people who are not safe and clean residents in our community, who are causing problems in our community, to move along. Those residents who are the problem tend to love our communities. It's a great place to recruit. It's a great place to find buyers for your products. And we really need to do our best to explain to a mother with 3 children how we're going to get rid of someone who has pervasive issues in the apartment above her. The problem now with a just cause bill is asking us to prove that empirically. It's asking us to go to court and ask that working mother to take off time from her job to come testify against her neighbor.
Well, here's the problem. This is someone's home, right? And so we're weighing the interest of someone being stable in their home against your interest in a safe and clean apartment building and home for other people, which is a very important interest. And I'm saying if the numbers are so small and these people are such a problem, then I think the burden probably needs to be on you to document the problem. All those things that you said are things that are documentable just causes, right? And I understand that if you're doing it in your apartment, you can't have a camera in there. There's administrative issues with that. But again, you have to think about, and you're not really addressing it for me, someone's right to have some place to live in a very expensive county and community, right? And to his point, maybe they've been in there. The data would be important. I'd love to see a little more on who's this happening to in our county, and I know there's been some efforts at that. So this is my final point, but it's just hard for me to weigh the right of someone to have a home and be stable in that home against your ability, much more resources, to document the problem.
The problem is that it's not about documentation for just cause. For just cause, it's about proof. Right. And the way we get the information is through our other residents, and asking our other residents to come have to testify against their neighbors in a situation where they don't feel safe, where they may lose a day's pay, is a virtual impossibility. So it's going to wind up in a protracted court battle that makes it virtually impossible to prove the level of cause this bill requires.
I'd just like to chime in on these issues as well, if I could have a moment. We were talking earlier about the presentation and the 45,000 cases that are currently being handled in courts. Now we're going to expand those exponentially if we have to go to court when we just decide we're not going to renew someone's lease. And so I think that's just going to further prolong the eviction process, the legal system process, and we're going to have many trials with witnesses and evidence regarding, criminal activity or lease violations at our properties. And it's just going to add to the legal expenses for everyone involved. And just when, I know you're concerned about, I've been to several work sessions on a variety of issues, and a big one is affordable housing. A big one is having folks live in urbanized areas near public transportation, welcoming families to our multifamily community. And families are a protected class, and these are families with children. Children are basically a protected class under the Fair Housing Act. And a number one issue that we see at our properties is safety relevance to children. And that affects so many of our operations, and children being able to go pick up the mail, get off the school bus, go to the apartment. And it just seems like, you know, we're sort of talking out of both sides of our mouth. We want these communities to be welcoming to families with children and to be a haven for these children. And yet, and you know, the parents might work, they're not there, you know, as soon as the kid gets off the bus. And yet, we're creating another situation where it becomes the landlord is handcuffed in eradicating conduct and activity at our properties that are dangerous to these children. That's what we're really talking about. We're not trying to be bad guys and disrupt somebody's home. It's going to be illegal activity. That, by the way, it's very hard to get law enforcement to partner with us to eradicate it because of civil rights laws. I get it. I support that. But, you know, you have somebody maybe, you know, engaging in prostitution, selling, using marijuana, that kind of thing. Very hard to deal with that through the criminal justice system. And so we would like to have some tools just to say at the end of the lease term, you're continuing to smoke.
In DC, they have this,
yeah.
this AOBA. Did we see this dramatic spike of cases that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, it is a long process in DC, but again, I think it's a little bit of apples and oranges only because DC is also a jurisdiction with rent control. And so looking at that timeline and how, and their processes and rules are very different from even this proposal or the current system in the county, which doesn't have rent control.
But
Does Just Cause apply to units that are not under rent control in DC?
Right, separate, the eviction laws are separate. And so there's the rent
control. It applies
control.
to all units.
Yes.
Just all units, right. And so when it passed, and you can use other parts of the country, but the point that was made, the premise was that you're going to have a flood of holdovers, you know, even though you didn't have that many previously. So that's the point.
Sure, no, I can, we manage many properties in DC, and we have basically residents or residents for life. We have to renew all residents, and it's very challenging to evict them, much less not renew the lease. And so that is the situation we deal with in DC. And I'm very involved in resident challenges at our properties, and it just absorbs an enormous amount of resources so that the other residents' needs are not able to be addressed because our hands are tied in terms of addressing residents whose activity at the property is clearly becoming a threat to the other residents in the community. And we do have just demographically, it's really fascinating, so many families with children who want to live in multifamily communities now. So it becomes a real safety issue.
Thank you.
Can I just real quick?
Well, I wanted to myself real quick, and then I can come to you real quick.
Okay.
I do see competing equities here. You know, the ability of a family or anyone to live in a community that is safe and pleasant, you know, that's what we want for everybody, right? That's the goal that we're trying to achieve. And I have some sympathy for the tenant who has a neighbor who is not breaking laws. You can't get a criminal prosecution, but they are disruptive. You know, there's a lot of, you know, it creates an unpleasant living environment. And that is the sort of the competing equity here, where we want to give people rights and not be, you know, not allow people to be evicted for no reason, but we also want to enable people to live in a safe and comfortable and, you know, pleasant environment. And today we allow the landlords essentially to regulate that. And, you know, that may have something to do with why many of our apartment communities are in better shape, I think. They are, you know, but, and so I'm worried that if we embrace this, that we would hinder the ability of our owners to create the environment that most tenants really want. Most tenants want the person who is making a lot of noise at night, you know, to not be renewed. And asking someone to testify in court against someone who might be a gang member is not viable. That's just not even a question, right? No one's going to do that. That's like taking your life into your hands. So, you know, that is an issue. So, John, how do you help me think about that approach?
Well, again, I can only speak to my clientele. There are many issues, but that is not what we see. We certainly see cases.
You serve a specific clientele, I suppose.
Well, we see cases where the complaint is that the tenant is disturbing the peace of the property. We certainly see those cases.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there's a remedy for that. It's called breach of lease. And most of our clients are sued under that rather than a tenant holding over action. So the landlord has that remedy.
Can I ask, so how does that apply if there's not a lease anymore?
It still happens. So it happens all the time.
Like,
So, but let me
okay,
clarify.
Yeah, you finish and I want to ask.
Let me go back to this issue. I tend to agree from where I sit is my tenants, my clients who have these issues are rarely in this position with the larger landlords. I think that's true. We see it a lot with the smaller landlords. And we see it a lot with smaller landlords who are accepting county money through HOC. That's where my clientele is getting hit the hardest with these problems. If we do see it from the larger landlord, very often if we get involved, we're going to resolve it one way or another.
What is a smaller landlord? What?
Well, you would be a smaller landlord, but I won't pick on you. But landlords who may buy properties to rent them out, my experience is they tend to be landlords who buy properties from tax sales or the like, and then run a
They
business.
typically own a handful of properties,
Yeah.
or 25 or
Yeah,
30
I mean,
still in your.
we track them, so, I mean, there are, as in any community, there are problem landlords, there are good landlords, but we tend to see the same landlords a lot in these issues. But, so, I mean, I don't think, I don't know what the numbers are, but I think the numbers from what we saw earlier today is that the number of tenant holding over cases versus failure to pay rent cases is minuscule. But for those individuals, of the, I don't know, maybe the 20 cases we've seen in the last 6 months, of the vast majority of those 20, and again, it's a different population than the entire population, were people who had not been afforded a lease for a long period of time. And then were told to leave for no reason at all. I have one now. A woman has rented a house in the city of Rockville. It's not an HOC house, it's a city of Rockville house. She's been there for 28 years. She's raising her grandchildren. The landlord and her got along great. The landlord's 94. His kids took over. They don't want to sell the house. They just want her to leave. After 28 years, she's heartbroken. And they don't have to give her any explanation at all. Get out. She got a letter, out you go.
They don't want to move in, they don't want to.
No, they don't even live in the county.
They just want a different tenant?
Yeah, they want to jack their prices up because it's near Twinbrook.
They can do that.
Well, they could raise the price on her, but the point is that that's the clients that we see. Where I see the biggest problem is actually with our elder population. We have a large number of this problem. A disproportionate number of these folks are over the age of 80, and they're being asked to leave. There may be many explanations for that, but the fact of the matter is that those are vulnerable people, and all this bill is saying is give them a reason. Tell them why they have to leave. Or if you have no reason, you just don't want to be dealing with an 80-year-old when you could rent it out to a 40-year-old, then, I mean, that's
I would think an 80-year-old would be a better tenant personally, but hey, what do I know?
Not always, but that's.
Excuse me. Oh, I just wanted to hop in for a second. I just want to clarify that the proposed legislation doesn't just require that we give them a reason. It also says we have to prove it in court. And one issue that I come up with a lot, I mean, that we all probably do, is that there can be a lot of behaviors at a community that are not specifically prohibited in a lease, but that are still problematic. Okay, and we see them, and it's troubling, but it could be not exposing yourself in the common areas. I'll be honest, I write our leases, I didn't put it in there. It didn't occur to me that, people must be properly closed in the common areas. But we actually have some issues like that, and it becomes a real concern again with the children. We have issues with, before the Airbnb and overnight subletting started, we didn't address that in our lease. And suddenly we found some residents were doing that, and I know subsequently some laws have been enacted, but that type of thing, it's not illegal, not covered in our lease, but we have people walking in and out in suitcases, families with children. Again, we do criminal background screening within the law of the occupants and residents of our communities, but the folks coming in through overnight subleasing, Airbnb activity are not. And so you have, again, children in the community, elderly people who are vulnerable, people with disabilities who are vulnerable, and you have this population coming in again. But our hands under this scenario would be tied for conceivably for things that actually aren't lease violations, but it just never entered our mind. But it's very clear that the activity can't continue at our property after we've given notices and warnings, and then our only option would be to not renew the lease. I mean, there's a laundry list of activities that we would want.
Council members who want to join the conversation here, so I think Mr. Katz are next, and then we'll go to Gabe.
Okay. Well, thank you. First off, is the definition, or it says that it's an illegal activity, but it doesn't say that it's that the activity has to be, someone has to be convicted in court. I mean, I don't know, is there a difference? Is there a definition of the word illegal in this one? I mean, if someone is, well, the question is, if you're saying it's illegal.
You have to have proof that it's illegal.
Well, but if you didn't take it to court and someone says that they did improper things in the courtyard, and someone saw it but didn't call the police, is that still considered illegal? I don't know. I'm asking.
Well, again, we see it all the time. It happens a lot in subsidized housing, where you have a hearing. Nobody's been convicted of, say, having growing marijuana in your apartment, but that's a violation of the federal law. And so there's a hearing before the HOC, and if they find that in fact you're doing it, they can evict you, or you can lose your voucher or whatever without a conviction. And similarly, that happens with a landlord. You could file a breach of lease saying you're growing marijuana, or you're selling marijuana, or you're selling PCP or whatever. There's no requirement for a conviction.
But there has to be evidence that.
Well, of course there has to be evidence. You can't just say it.
Right, but you then have to have somebody who will create that evidence.
Yeah, what would the evidence be if it's not a conviction?
Well, if someone complained that someone was doing something in the courtyard, they had to tell management in some way. I mean, in this case, it would be the larger places. But if it was if a neighbor called the former, their former neighbor who happened to keep that house, then they would say, look, so and so is doing all of this, and at that point, to me, if that's considered, if you don't have to have a conviction but it's still illegal, I think that's certainly a different burden, is what I'm attempting to say on that. I also, and part of this says that someone says, look, you know what, I want to get out of the rental business. I'm done. You're going to have to leave, and they in an individual, not the apartment buildings, and they try to sell, and the person has to leave. I mean, they put it on the market. Well, they don't sell it. So the question is, how long does it have to be for sale before that's considered that they could rent it again? They're obviously more than likely the person that left had to leave and has already found another place. So how long does that happen? I mean, and then they're saying that I want this for my own son. My son's coming back. I don't have a son, so it's easy for me to say this. My son's coming back, and I want this place for my son. Well, the son comes in and stays in there for a week or whatever, so that they can get that tenant out. My point is, the way this is written, there's a lot of quote unquote loopholes with this thing as far as I'm seeing it. I mean, someone could in effect say they are doing something and really aren't. And this is still, the bottom line on this one is, this is saying that if someone doesn't pay their rent, you're still going to have to go to court. If someone doesn't do all of these things, this is saying when you want to when the lease itself becomes available, whether or not someone would be able to say, I don't want to lease to you anymore. And the tenant has that right. The tenant has the right to say, I don't want to be here anymore. And after given, proper notice, 60, 90 days. But the landlord wouldn't have that right, to me, is the biggest deal here. And so to me, all that we're discussing at this point is whether or not it should be fair for a landlord to say, look, you've done everything I've asked you to do, but I don't like you anymore, I want you to leave, whether there's a personality conflict or whatever, and whether that should be allowed. And as far as I'm concerned on that one issue, I believe that somebody should be told why they're being forced to leave. I mean, if someone lived there for 20 years, then I believe that someone should be told, look, this is the reason. And if they want to sell their house, this allows for it. If they want to raise the rent, this allows for it. This allows for a lot of things that a landlord would have to go through. A landlord is doing this because they're in the business of being a landlord. They're in the business of making money for what they wanted to do. And I certainly applaud that. And you want rental housing. I mean, you need a place for people to live. But to me, what is being suggested, because you don't have to convict somebody in court, you don't have to do any of these things, to me, this isn't so out of sorts as far as I'm concerned.
If I may jump in on that. I would just say that if the bill stated, and I've heard several times people today talking about giving them a reason, if the bill stated that you must state a reason in your tenant holding over notice that they have to leave, and then if your reason doesn't hold up, there are discrimination actions, there are fair housing guidance, there's a million ways that a tenant could then get the support they need. That would be a very different bill. That is not the bill before us. The bill before us says you must have just cause, and that means there is an element of proof in a court of law required in order for this to pass and in order for us to be able to successfully evict someone who is no longer on lease. And so this is not a notice bill. This is a proof bill, and I think that distinction needs to be made.
So I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. But I have dived into this, and I still have a lot of questions, and I'm meeting with Delegate Wilkins in the very near future to talk a little bit more about it. But this is the place I want to start from. I really appreciate her leadership on this. I know she's been thoughtful. She's had 3 public sessions at the Silver Spring Civic Building in which she has invited the various players to talk about what can be a pretty complex issue when you get into the weeds. But on the surface, clearly, I think from a social justice standpoint, it's important that we help protect our tenants and help make sure that they have all of the rules and regulations that should be afforded to them. But we also have to acknowledge that landlords have rights too. And I want to share a personal story because we all bring different perspectives to every issue, but the one that I bring to this one specifically that I think is somewhat relevant is I worked in Langley Park a lot when I worked for an organization called the Latin American Youth Center. And we worked with families who, and unfortunately, there was a pervasive gang issue in Langley Park at the time. And the level of intimidation that families were feeling within those apartment complexes was palpable. There were a variety of issues that were happening, and law enforcement was doing their best to stay in front of the issue. But it was, I saw with my own 2 eyes, the challenges, that situation, extreme challenges, to be fair, but not, unfortunately, we have those challenges here in Montgomery County as well, and I will say that they are growing. And so I am concerned about the unintended consequence of a family being reluctant to come forward when there is an instance in which somebody may not be breaking all the official rules, but there are words unspoken that often happen in communities like this that do lead to intimidation, and that would make it less likely for somebody to come forward, and now under this potential law, more difficult for the person causing that trouble to be removed. And that is a concern, and it is a sincere and legitimate one. The other concern I do have is with the court system. And I know that You know, there are, as we heard, 46,000 cases that are currently processed now. I have heard from our judicial branch in the past in my travels over the last year and a half concerns about capacity as a whole. And so as we embark in passing legislation, I believe it's always important to make sure that the infrastructure is in place to actually be able to carry out that legislation effectively. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more. They're not here today, but they are an important player in this conversation from our circuit court and our judicial branch to find out from their perspective what their opinion is, generally speaking, from a process perspective and an administrative perspective, because I think that's an important point.
District court.
District court. The other potential unintended consequence that I am concerned about, we heard from our planning department as recently as today that Montgomery County lags significantly behind the rest of the region in the development of properties, period. We are not building at a pace consistent with other jurisdictions, and housing remains one of the biggest challenges facing our community as a whole. We have a very clear supply and demand issues that is unintentionally leading to a lot of consequences and significantly impacting economic development. And so it is a factor in my overall thinking in terms of how we're looking at this specific bill and any legislation that's out there that could potentially have an unintended consequence of making it less likely for somebody to build in an environment where we're already lagging behind the rest of the region. And so that is going into my deliberation. And then finally, although I appreciate Delegate Wilkins's amendment, because I believe my initial concern on this issue to a large degree has been addressed by her bill, but her amendment to her bill, but I do support in principle the addition of the accessory dwelling units that our council is deliberating now, because it will provide an additional income for people who are on fixed incomes and want to stay in their residence but can't. That disproportionately often impacts our older adult population. It also provides more housing options in a variety of different communities across the county. And I know that there are a number of people who would be interested in exploring an accessible dwelling unit if the county makes it easier to be able to access one, but may be reluctant to begin with, and I'm concerned about any legislation that makes it even more reluctant for them to be able to move forward. But I will say, as a sidebar, and I address this to my colleague, Councilmember Reamer, as part of that accessory dwelling unit bill, I think there does need to be an education component for new landlords who really don't know what they're getting themselves into, aren't familiar with the laws and procedures, and create an environment where there could be, an issue that arises and them choosing to evict somebody because they don't like the way they dress, or and so there does need to be, as part of that legislation, that conversation. So those are some of my initial thoughts on this issue. I look forward to speaking to Delegate Wilkins in the very near future, and I appreciate all parties. Those were my comments. I guess I have a question. I know that there has been discussion within those 3 sessions. Again, to Delegate Wilkins's credit, she has reached out to find out if there's any feedback, but is there something, is there common ground that can be found in this legislation? And I will have to address that with her because she's not here, but I've heard from AOBA regarding change to the language that may soften their position on this. I'm not sure, but I would be curious as to whether there is some common ground that's out there that maybe we haven't explored, or some other avenue that would be helpful. I don't know the answer to that, but that's something that I'm contemplating as well.
I guess just a couple follow-up comments. Just to iterate, well, first, as Councilman Friedson noted earlier, there are good housing providers, and, well, I would say the vast majority of housing providers are compliant. They care about their communities, they're invested in their communities, and the same thing for residents. And I think the findings in the report confirm what we've suspected, that the numbers are very low. Now, obviously, for those who are being evicted, that's a significant experience. You're talking about somebody's home. But the numbers are low in comparison to the total number of units. Interestingly, the report echoed what my colleague to the far left said about small housing providers, and that really indicates maybe an opportunity for outreach or education. What our experience is in many jurisdictions is when you have instances of concerns or housing code violations, it does tend to usually be the smaller housing providers, and not necessarily because of any willful activity. It's about access to information. I know, for example, that we've received notices from DHCA about information on programming that's targeted to that community. So if anything, again, when you look at the numbers, do we need a legislative change? No. Is there an opportunity for outreach, targeted outreach, specifically to smaller housing providers? And that's something that we can partner with, and my colleagues in the industry can partner with in providing information, because if those housing providers are informed about their rights and responsibilities, we all benefit.
I will stress one thing that I think we need to tease out even further, and that is our senior community, which is the fastest growing demographic in Montgomery County. It's 9% today over the age of 65. It will be 22% over the next 16 years. Now that goes well beyond just housing, but housing is a critical element to that issue. And so I do want to have further conversations around that specific circumstance. And the fact that what we're hearing anecdotally from legal aid is that those folks are being disproportionately impacted breaks my heart. And that is absolutely something that I don't know that this legislation even addresses fully, because there's a holistic element to this that needs to be explored. But there's a lot of room for improvement as a county in how we support and treat our elders.
Just as a follow-up to that as well, thank you for mentioning that. One of the things that we've done is we've partnered with DHA probably for 4 years, and actually even before my time, where specifically to seniors, one of the things that the county noticed that there was a lot of resources, people weren't utilizing those resources. So it wasn't DHA, it was HHS and a couple other agencies that they put together a presentation that we took to our property managers. So seniors, for example, experiencing hoarding, seniors that maybe you're not seeing that person in the unit and you don't know what they are because our folks are not social workers. They would put together a package, and we've taken that presentation to different areas. I think we've had it in Rockville, Bethesda, Silver Spring. So that's one way that we partnered with the county to provide information so people know. Maybe it's access to transportation, maybe it's who to call if they're not paying their rent, and so someone from HHS can call and intervene. The other comment I would make is we're looking at legislation in a post-1915 world. And one of the many things that 1915 legislation did, as Councilmember Reamer knows.
Bill 1915.
Sorry, well now, yes, Bill 19. Sorry.
Whoa, you're
well beyond it.
Yeah. I've been here, yes.
Both.
The law that's now codified was provide enhanced protections for tenants. And a lot of that is additional disclosures that are specific to information on who to call if you're about to be evicted. So there is a notice requirement that goes out. It's not a pre-filing notice, but it's like before you increase your rent, before you issue the notice to vacate, we have to provide a notice. Like, the information is provided from the agency on eviction prevention or an eviction assistance. They get the tenant handbook. There's information identified in the notice of rent increase. Now we have the lease summary, which is also now going to say you don't have to pay your rent. So I think it's a very different environment that we're in when we're looking at the data that was provided in the very good OLO report, plus the enhanced tenant protections that are in place as a result of 1915, and the disclosure requirements and the additional information that's being provided to tenants is, of course, in addition to a very comprehensive inspection program, which I believe has to be completed by July of this year. So with every unit in the county is going through this kind of enhanced or new inspection protocol. So I think think when you look at kind of that, all of those things together, the question is, you know, what else is really necessary? Is it, and maybe again, as I noted with smaller housing providers, there's an opportunity to provide additional educational opportunities. Speaking of the district, for example, they have, I mean, it's a larger number of units, but they specifically have a small housing provider. And that person's task is within the agency to communicate with that specific constituency. And one of the things we've done is directed them to work with, you know, their equivalent of DEP on lead-based paint enforcement and things like that. You don't necessarily need to identify and designate a specific person, but just the opportunity to continue that education and outreach to that community so they have the information about what their rights and responsibilities are.
All right, we have Mr. Friedson.
I appreciate what everybody has said. I'm still taking all of this in and trying to understand a little bit. I just had a quick question. You talked about the woman who lived in her single-family home for 28 years and was asked to leave because of a new landlord. I'm just trying to understand how this changes. Presumably the new landlord, the child of the former landlord, maybe wanted more money. Potentially, that could be the issue. Wouldn't in that case, wouldn't they?
Know.
You don't know.
Because they don't have to tell us.
Right.
I have no idea what they want.
Right.
They haven't communicated anything to our clients saying like, you know, we want to sell the house. I mean, that would be one thing.
If they wanted that, that would be okay.
If they wanted to raise the rent, if they wanted to sell the house, if they wanted to occupy the house, those would all be just causes.
But they just can't, they delivered a notice and said, you have 60 days to get out.
It's totally fair, and I'm very, I mean, it's a horrible situation. I appreciate the earlier.
My son is in 5th grade who wants to graduate from his school this year. He's not going to be able to do that.
So I'm just trying, so it seems to me that one of the major bases that is of concern to the larger landlords.
We don't know, though, whether this bill would affect that particular case.
Right.
We don't.
Because it could be that there's a just cause behind it. We don't know.
But that's the point, is if there's a just cause.
Yeah, and so I just want to focus on that for a second, because we talked earlier, and my main point was, you know, almost 2/3 of the eviction issues were related to 22%, I believe, or 23% of the issues. You reiterated the fact that, at least anecdotally, your office is not interfacing with larger, you know, multiple large unit type landlords like the ones who are represented here, more smaller number of landlords, which could be an education issue. It could be a number of issues. We don't know. They could have, you know, if you're a large landlord, you have more to lose if you handle things the wrong way, and there are more people involved in it. There are a lot of reasons for that. But it seems to me that your main concern, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing is, I think I heard it's the difference between a reason and proving it in court. And that was what I heard, and I've heard that consistently throughout your testimony.
That's absolutely correct. If this was purely a notice bill, I don't think any of us, I can't speak for Nicola's constituents, but I can speak for myself and say we would not be here. We'd be working with you on what the language of the notice would say. But we support notice to tenants, we support transparency, and we support a tenant's rights. And in the situation we heard about the woman who's about to lose her home, we are incredibly empathetic to that. And if I can speak to Mr. Jawando's point that he asked earlier, where he said, you know, this is an incredibly small number, so why shouldn't the burden shift to the landlord? And my answer to you, sir, is that the burden does not shift to the landlord, it shifts to all the other constituents in our community. And that by creating a just cause bill to anecdotally resolve the small number of cases, while very serious, but that can be addressed elsewhere, you are putting everyone else in our community at risk. So the burden is a much bigger shift than the economic burden to the landlord.
So just if I could ask, because one of the concerns that you responded when I asked about the 28-year-old, or the 28-year tenured tenant in the single-family home, do you think a notice requirement versus a provable in court requirement would resolve some of the issues that you've raised with the clients that you've talked about? Or would that fall short of what you think would resolve the problem as you perceive it?
what my colleague is referring to as a notice. The tenant has to receive a notice to vacate.
No, but to
What is this
put a
notice?
reason, so there's a difference between having a notice that has a
if they
reason
put a
in the notice versus
the landlord
having to
said-
prove in court the.
Right, so the landlord says, I don't like the way you mow your lawn, or the grass is too long, you haven't mowed it often enough. Is that good cause? I mean, should the tenant just say, oh, you're right, I'm gonna move out? Or you're causing a disturbance in the apartment. Well, no, I'm not. I reject that opinion. Now what? Who gets to decide that? In the current circumstances, the tenant has no right at that point. The landlord can say out. The landlord becomes the judge, as well as the accuser. And, you know, there's always going to be stories on both sides. There's always examples. Legislation is about balancing interests, which you have all have said today. But there is no, in this particular problem, the tenant has no leverage at all.
Your view is unless it's a standard of proving it in court, that it wouldn't have the teeth that it
So
needs.
let's
I'm just trying to understand.
Let's talk about the reality of it. So let's say the landlord says, you've caused a disturbance, you continually cause disturbance in our apartment complex, all right? They come to me as their lawyer and say, well, what do you think? I'm going to call the landlord's lawyer and say, what evidence do you have? And they're going to say, we have all these tenants who have complained. The police have been here 3 times. Doesn't mean they've had an arrest. They've had to break up parties, whatever it may be. What do you think I'm going to tell my client at that point? I'm going to say, let's go to court and get our brains beat in? So, I mean, a lot of these things resolve just on that basis alone, as they do today even. But the point is, there are times when the tenant feels aggrieved or where they're just wrongly accused or there's just no reason for it, and they have no recourse. And that's what this bill is attempting to do, is to give the tenant some recourse.
I have one last question. Based on the way that the bill is written as the amendments before us that Delegate Wilkins is planning to put in, not liking the way you dress or how you mow your lawn or whatever the case may be, even if that were the main reason, is there anything that would prevent the landlord from presenting a just cause that wouldn't be required to be provable in court? Like, I plan to move, or I'm raising the rent to a point at which I don't believe this person would renew, and then they'll be forced to decline. I mean, the larger point being that, would this just change the way that the landlord-tenant relationship, because we're focused on problem landlords, which I think we all recognize is a small it's an important problem, but it's a small proportion of the total number of landlords that we're talking about.
Well, first of all, on rent, the landlord can raise the rent now. I think we should set that to the side. I mean, the landlord could.
Well, but my point is, it's not that we're setting it to the side. My point is if there are specific points at which you can move somebody out of a unit and you want to move somebody out of the unit, you don't have to do that now, but just raising it to a level that would be untenable.
You could do that now.
Yeah, if I could jump in, you could raise the rent, or you could also, just like earlier scenario, you could say, oh, I'm gonna have my son move in, and then there's gonna be, son moves in for 2 months as a shill, moves out, and then it's replaced. So we're gonna have, there's no it's gonna be very difficult to enforce this law, and then we're gonna have to create another office of just cause evictions and hire 5 lawyers to go back and enforce it. So there's really, it's like, it's a solution looking for a problem that if you actually want to enact it, you're going to have to hire a whole office to enforce it. Because anytime what you could really just do is like, I'm going to increase the rent by $1,000 a month and they'll have to move out anyway.
So I think I have a number of more questions. I think all of my colleagues have a number of more questions, but I think I'm over my time, and I think maybe as a committee we're over our time, so I'm going to hold off.
Let Will get in a final question, and then we do have to shut down here.
Thank you, and this has been a great discussion. Thank you for all the points. Since you addressed my earlier question directly, I just wanted to say back, certainly sensitive to all the residents in the building, and especially in a larger building. I think there are so many ways that you can, again, it's a quarter law, you can raise rent. There's so many ways that you could seek to get someone out of your apartment. Right now, to your point, there's no, if the lease ends, the tenant has no way to say anything about it. And I think that's what we're trying to, the need for a home, the need for stability. Maybe there's a way to think about it in some amendments that could address your concern. But again, I don't understand the point you made about the thinking about all the other tenants. That assumes there's some like really super smart criminal in there that you just can't catch, that you know, that they're conniving, they no way to prove it. And again, you don't have to have them convicted. You just have to have some evidence. It could be written affidavits. People don't necessarily have to go to court. There's a lot of evidence. I am the one lawyer on the council. People don't necessarily have to go and testify. So I just want to say,
We got no shortage of lawyers around here, Mr. Juwan. I
Yeah.
gotta let you know.
No,
but on the council, we don't have anyone. Just let me finish my point. And so I just want to be careful about saying, you know, if it's not that double-edged argument of there's not that many cases, then you can't, why are you so against that? It just doesn't make any sense in that regard.
I would simply say that fair housing laws, anti-discrimination laws, those all prevent us from jacking up someone's rent to get them out. Educated landlords know that our hands are tied and the way we can get out bad actors is very limited. And you and I can agree to disagree, Mr. Jawando. I respect your positions immensely. But in our estimation, this small number, legislation, to borrow from Mr. Friedson's analogy earlier, this is a hatchet to what should be a scalpel. And this is going to have ripple effects throughout our communities that are unintended consequences of this bill. And there are ways to fix the bill that are already in the law, the anti-retaliation laws, the anti-discrimination laws, and wrongful eviction suits that are brought by many. So there are remedies for these few cases, whereas a legislation that prevents us from taking action against bad actors is much harder to
It doesn't
unlock.
prevent you, it requires you to have an additional step and show just cause. And I would bring to my office later the stacks and reams of data that the places where just cause eviction exists, you have all these huge units of just cause in DC, and the cases have astronomically gone up, because I haven't seen that. And so if you have that, bring it. But I think these points are overblown.
Well, I just want to mention, it's just a deterrent, so that we don't even, in a jurisdiction like DC, wouldn't even go there not to renew. And that's in all the, when my company is all around the country, it just, all right, we give up and we're like, fine, they renew, and then we have these ongoing issues that are challenged. But I wanted to just jump in for Mr. Albarnez's point earlier. You know, we had the legislation 1915 enacted 2 years ago. We're not having as much development in this country, in this county, because of the extensive housing regulation. I know the NAA has created a specific addenda just for Montgomery County because there's so many laws that have to be complied with here. And I know that when we move into a new jurisdiction, which is, I suppose that's something we want, when new companies come in here to provide housing, it's very, very expensive just to gear up with all the regulatory compliance. So the more layers of compliance, which this bill supposes will increase the cost of moving into Montgomery County and opening up new housing and affordable housing, and I hope that's considered.
I would like to just ask staff to help me think about this issue of just sort of problematic tenants who, you know, may not have, you know, committed an offense that the police are able to catch them for, but are disturbing the community, and how we grapple with that in this context. So I think there's some follow-up I'd like to consider, because I am concerned about public safety, and just want to make sure that you know, we're always able to put that first. So it's been a very good discussion. Thank you so much. And the full council will be taking up the state bill soon. I'm not sure if I know the date. Somebody does, but we'll.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you for being here today.